The morning I realized my homeowners association had officially lost its mind, I woke up to the sound of a diesel engine coughing through lake fog and found a tow truck backing down my boat ramp like it was about to recover a sunken Corvette. Except what was hauling away was two bright orange kayaks. My kayaks, hanging from steel hooks like they'd been arrested at dawn for crimes against property values. And standing there, off to the side, sipping cucumber water with a clipboard tucked under one arm, was Karen Bloom in a neon sash that said Lake Enforcement Volunteer, like she'd just been crowned queen of a very stupid little kingdom. I stood there in my slippers, coffee cooling in my hand, and I remember thinking, well, that's new. Not the kayak theft, exactly. The arrogance, the theater of it. The fact that she looked pleased with herself, like towing a man's private property off his own dock before breakfast was somehow public service. That was the moment I knew this thing had stopped being annoying and started becoming something else. My name's Eli, and Silverthorn Cove isn't just where I live. It's where I grew up, where I learned how weather sound before it arrives, where I work, where I paddle, where I go when I need the rest of the world to shut up for 5 minutes. My grandfather left me this land, along with most of the shoreline on our end of the lake. And he left me something else too, responsibility. He spent half his life protecting that water, restoring habitat, fighting off bad ideas from county officials and greedy developers who looked at a living lake and saw nothing but a brochure. So when I say I take that place seriously, I mean it in a way people like Karen never quite understand. Things had been peaceful for years. Then the new development went up on the south end, and with it came the HOA. At first, it was the usual nonsense. Flyers about noise. Friendly little reminders about trash cans. Suggestions that people paint things in community colors, which is a kind of phrase that makes my skin crawl. Then they elected Karen president. And once that happened, every foolish instinct in that woman put on a crown. She started acting like the lake belonged to the board. Not legally, of course. Spiritually, aesthetically, morally. However people like that justify control, when they don't actually have ownership. Within months, she formed a lake task force with Ron and Sheila, two loyal followers who dressed like they were one visor away from joining a suburban militia. I watched them at first like you watch geese fight over bread. Weirdly aggressive, but not my problem. Then it became my problem. They put up signs overnight. No private kayaks. No unauthorized vessels. No fishing from unregistered docks. They even rolled out these HOA-branded paddle boats that looked like props from a children's theme park and held a little ceremony for them by the water. A ceremony for paddle boats. You tell me that doesn't sound like the beginning of a curse. I still might have ignored most of it, honestly, if they hadn't gone after Walter. Walter was one of my clients, a retired Marine with a prosthetic leg, and the kind of quiet dignity that makes loud people seem even smaller. I'd been letting him use one of my kayaks for water therapy. The lake helped him. That was enough for me. One morning he called, embarrassed, saying 2 HOA volunteers had stopped him at the dock and told him he was trespassing with illegal equipment. Illegal equipment. The man was trying to paddle, not overthrow a government. I apologized, told him I'd handle it, and walked straight down to my dock. And that was when I saw my kayaks were gone. At first I thought a storm might have loosened them, but there'd been no storm. So I checked the security footage. There it was, clean as day. An HOA contractor pulling up before sunrise, unhooking both kayaks from my private dock, loading them onto a trailer, and driving off. No notice, no conversation, no legal authority, just theft dressed up as policy. I drove straight to the HOA office. The place looked like a spa designed by a lawsuit. Soft music, citrus air freshener, fake calm everywhere. Karen sat behind a front desk beneath a sign that said Community Peace Coordinator, which was funny enough to almost distract me from a crime she'd committed. I told her my kayaks had been stolen. She smiled, handed me a laminated pamphlet, and said they had been towed under Article 19, subsection C of the Lake Use Guidelines. I asked when exactly I had agreed to any lake use guidelines. She laughed. actually laughed. Then she told me my signature wasn't necessary because the HOA had jurisdiction over lake access, and she was doing community a favor by keeping the area beautiful. Now, I could have argued right there, could have raised my voice, could have let anger do what anger likes to do, which is make you feel strong for about 10 seconds and stupid for the next 6 months. But I didn't. I just looked at her, really looked at her, and saw a woman so deep in her own fantasy of authority that she had no idea what line she crossed. So I thanked her. That seemed to throw her a little. Then I turned around, walked back to my truck, drove home, and opened a file I hadn't touched in years. My grandfather's conservation agreement. See, what Karen didn't know was that our family retained legal authority over ecological maintenance, sediment testing, and water management for the southern half of Silverthorn Cove. My grandfather had negotiated that decades ago when the county wanted broader control of the lake. He preserved a rare arrangement, private stewardship backed by law. Hidden inside that dusty paperwork was the one thing Karen and people like her always forget to check before they start throwing rules around like confetti. Actual power. I called my friend Lupe, an attorney who handled property rights and environmental law. I told her everything, from Walter getting harassed to the kayaks getting hauled off at dawn. She listened, quiet the whole time, and when I finished, she said, "Looks like it's time to remind them who actually controls the water." That sentence settled in me like a key turning. I spent that evening in the old valve shed behind the reeds, running my hand along my grandfather's blueprints and thinking through what came next. I wasn't interested in revenge. Not the hot kind. Anyway, this was colder than revenge. Cleaner. This was correction. The lake had an outflow control system for maintenance and ecological protection. If conditions required it, I could lawfully lower the water level, provided the state was notified and the work was documented. So that's what I did. Before dawn the next morning, I filed the maintenance report with the Department of Water Resources. Lupe sent the formal notice to the county and confirmed what I already suspected. Once the permit was filed, temporary access restrictions were legally enforceable. By the time the HOA woke up and started steaming milk for their little waterfront brunch fantasies, I was already in full compliance. I remember feeling oddly calm, not happy, not angry, just precise. The system was old, but it worked beautifully. Low hum, steady release, careful flow control. Nothing dramatic. No giant splash, no villain speech, no thunder in the distance. Just a lake beginning, inch by inch, to breathe differently. By afternoon, I put up a simple wooden sign near the walking trail. Temporary ecological maintenance in progress. Water levels subject to change. There was even a QR code linking to the county filing, because I believe in documentation, and because there's something deeply satisfying about offering legal clarity to people addicted to made-up authority. Ron was the first one to show up. He marched up to my porch that evening in a golf shirt, so tight it looked medically supervised, pointed at the sign, and demanded an explanation. I offered him lemonade and suggested he scan the code. He did. I watched his face change as he read. It went from indignant red to funeral pale in about 5 seconds flat. He asked if Karen knew. I said she will. By the next morning, the lake had dropped enough to expose the base of the HOA's floating patio, which, as it turned out, had not been properly anchored. That structure tilted like a drunk wedding cake and dumped plastic chairs into the shallows. Sheila tried to fish them out with a pool skimmer, while shouting at nobody in particular. I watched from a distance and had one of those rare moments in life where reality is funnier than anything you could have written. Then the local gossip machine kicked in. Photos hit neighborhood forums. People started asking whether Silverthorn was drying up, being drained, cursed, sabotaged, or targeted by federal weather experiments. Somebody blamed a stolen flamingo float. Somebody else blamed billionaires. I laughed harder reading those comments than I had in weeks. But underneath the comedy, pressure was building. Karen called an emergency HOA meeting under the gazebo. She showed up in full costume. Sash, visor, clipboard, the whole sad pageant. The board accidentally broadcast a meeting through a wireless speaker system. So half the neighborhood heard her declare that the lake was being sabotaged by a rogue resident with a grudge. Then Ron, with all the enthusiasm of a hostage reading a ransom note, held up the official permit. That changed the room. People started asking smart questions. Why hadn't the HOA checked water rights before building floating structures? Why were residents being fined over mailbox colors while the board was out there making changes to a lake they didn't control? Why had private property been towed? And once people started asking the right questions, bad leaders began to rot in public. A local reporter showed up after that. Then another. The story spread. What really broke Karen, though, wasn't the headlines. It was court. She tried to file for a restraining order, claiming my maintenance work endangered protected wildlife and amounted to ecological misconduct. Lupe read the filing and laughed so hard she had to stop for breath. Then she filed a counter with time-stamped drone footage showing HOA contractors months earlier dumping gravel, placing concrete blocks, and dredging near the shoreline for their little marina project, without permits. That was the twist Karen never saw coming. She thought she was dragging me into court. What she actually did was drag her own board into sunlight. The judge was not in the mood for nonsense. After Lupe played the footage, the room went very quiet. Karen claimed the video was fake. The judge looked over her glasses and asked if she had permits for any of the construction shown. She did not. The restraining order got denied. The court ordered an investigation into unlicensed lake development. And just like that, the woman who'd stolen my kayaks in the name of community standards was standing in a courthouse looking like a candle that realized the room was too warm. After that, public opinion turned fast. Residents started rebelling in their own funny little ways. Teenagers hosted a mud soccer game and called it Puddle Fest. Two old men set lawn chairs in the shallows and fished for what one of them described as emotional closure. Somebody printed stickers that said, "Drained but not defeated." The HOA had wanted uniformity. What it got was mockery, rebellion, and a community suddenly remembering it had a spine. And then Karen made her last mistake. I had wildlife cameras set up around the maintenance zone to monitor returning species and equipment. One night, one of them caught her sneaking down in black clothes with bolt cutters and a wrench, looking like a villain in a community theater production of suburban crime. She crouched next to a flow regulator, tried to force a valve, slipped in the mud, and went face first into a puddle of lake sludge. I watched that footage the next morning 3 times in silence. Not because I was stunned, because I was trying to be fair. A man ought to give himself a moment before enjoying something that much. I sent it to Lupe. She sent it to the county. Somebody leaked it to the local news. The clip aired with dramatic piano under it. And from there it took on a life of its own. Memes, GIFs, slow motion replays. The whole town got to watch Karen Bloom rise from the mud, like an angry swamp spirit who'd lost a fight with gravity. That was the end of her. The HOA held a confidence vote. Barely anyone showed. Most voted against her. One person apparently wrote, "Bring back the lake," in the margin, which I still think is poetry in its own way. She got removed, tried to scream her way through a potluck a few days later, and was escorted out by 2 residents holding paper plates. Then a moving truck showed up at her house. By the next morning, she was gone. Once the noise cleared, the real work began. The temporary leadership group that replaced her wasn't glamorous. Thank God. Just ordinary people in folding chairs, drinking lemonade in a garage, asking how to help. They wanted the lake back, not as a prop, not as a status symbol, but as a place. I could work with that. I finished the restoration process, documented the sediment, mapped the invasive species, cleared debris, and then one quiet morning before sunrise, I began restoring the water flow. The lake came back slowly, the way healing usually does. No dramatic swell, just inches, then more, then edges softening into shoreline again, Reeds stood back up. Frogs got louder. Fish returned in flashes. Kids started gathering by the docks to watch puddles turn into water again. It felt less like fixing something, and more like letting it remember itself. A week later, I hosted a small gathering by the dock. Lemonade, sandwiches, lawn chairs, nothing fancy. Walter came with his daughter and grandkids. I bought him 2 new kayaks, and when he saw them tied there waiting, he didn't say much. He just stood beside me with wet eyes and nodded once. That was enough. People came, more than I expected. Even a few folks who had once followed Karen's memos like scripture showed up with pies and awkward smiles. And for the first time in a long while, nobody talked about violations or board authority or aesthetics. They talked about fishing, about memories, about how ridiculous the whole thing had been, about how strange it was that draining a lake had somehow brought a community closer to the truth. Later, the new HOA president got appointed. Greg, a retired librarian with a soft voice and no appetite for drama. At his first meeting, he suggested replacing the HOA flag ritual with a wind chime, and nobody objected. That's how I knew we might survive. He and the new board worked with Lupe to draft a co-management agreement for the lake. Not control, not domination, shared stewardship, balance. We signed it over a folding table stained with lemonade rings and cookie crumbs, which felt just about perfect. Karen never came back. I heard rumors. New neighborhood, new complaints. Same soul. Didn't matter. Silverthorn had moved on. These days, when I sit out on my porch and watch the water settle under evening light, I think about how easily people confuse access with ownership and rules with wisdom. That whole mess taught me something my grandfather probably knew all along. Power without humility turns ridiculous before it turns dangerous. And if nobody checks it, it'll keep going until it breaks something that matters. In our case, it broke against the lake. And the lake won, not because I shouted louder, not because I played dirty, because I had the truth, the paperwork, and the patience to let arrogance destroy itself in public. The last image I still carry is Walter out on the water after everything was over, paddling slow in the sunset with one of his grandkids riding up front, both of them cutting a clean line across the quiet surface like none of the chaos had ever happened. Behind them, the shore was calm. No sash, no signs, no fake authority. Just the sound of water doing what water has always done, outlasting foolish people. So here's what I want to ask you. When someone grabs power they were never given and starts calling it order, where do you think the line is between patience and payback? And if you've ever dealt with a person or an HOA that mistook control for community, tell me how it ended. Because I'll say this much. Sometimes karma doesn't come yelling. Sometimes it shows up with a permit, lowers the water, and lets the mud tell the truth.